I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar on open climate responsive budgeting, which is the fourth and final webinar in our series on just and equitable climate finance for the Caribbean. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Ayanka Grandison, and I'm Resilience Program Manager at CANARI, and I'll be moderating today. We're really glad that you're all able to join us. Please feel free to put your name, organization, and the country that you are from in the chat and say hello. Before we get started, just the usual Zoom housekeeping. So we'll ask people to mute unless you're speaking or asking a question. We'll also, I think, other than the speakers, suggest that people don't have their cameras on just to help with bandwidth and ensure we don't have any technical difficulties. Definitely use the chat so you can put questions that you have, but you can also put any queries, or if you're having technical issues, you can't hear properly or something, let us know. My colleague Aaron Peter is here for tech support and will be checking the chat. And definitely we want this to be interactive, so feel free to raise your hand, ask questions during the Q&A sessions, or use the chat if for some reason you can't find the raise hand function or your audio isn't working that well. And as you can see, we are recording this, and we'll be able to share a link to the recording as well as the slides and any other relevant materials afterwards. So don't worry about that. So as we celebrate International Day of Climate Action today, I actually wanted to reflect on the fact that last year, at this time, CANARI and the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance had just published our collective agenda on climate justice and building local resilience as a call to action. And one of the key priorities for action on the agenda was improving access to and delivery of climate finance for frontline communities, small and micro enterprises, and civil society organizations as part of a whole of society approach, and making sure that we really get the money where it matters. And I think this focus, as I think you all agree, still remains very relevant, especially coming out of the SIDS4 conference in Antigua and Barbuda early in the year. And as we look towards COP29, which I think, as many of you know, has been dubbed the Climate Finance COP, and is going to be happening in 3 weeks from now, I think. So with global attention on finance this year, I think this series that we've been holding has been a really nice opportunity to really discuss some of these critical issues around climate finance and the challenges, and to advocate for more just, inclusive, rights-based, and even innovative approaches to really help us achieve what we want to achieve. So I'll share a link in the chat to the Climate Justice and Resilience Agenda for those who want to check it out. And, just to kind of hone in very quickly on our topic for today, which is on open climate responsive budgeting, which I think may seem surprising to some, as people often think of budgeting as a central government job. But I think there is a role for citizens to play and civil society organizations in this process, and ensuring that we effectively use domestic finance to tackle the climate crisis. And we have two fantastic speakers lined up for today on this topic, Dr. Priya Mohan and Ms. Lisa Perch, who I will introduce shortly. But I'll just kind of quickly run through our agenda for this afternoon. So we'll be starting off, as I'm already doing, with our welcome and overview. Then we'll go into the two presentations. And then we'll have a plenary discussion thinking through some of the challenges and opportunities and what are the priorities looking towards COP29 before we talk about next steps and close. So that's what we have on the agenda for today. And I think with that, I will kind of kick us off with our presenters. So first up, we have Dr. Priya Mohan, Senior Fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES, at the University of West Indies in St. Augustine. Her research is interdisciplinary and innovative, addressing various topics related to Caribbean development, including climate resilience and climate finance, disaster risk management, and also looking at extractive industries and firm competitiveness, all with a focus on finding solutions to the pressing challenges facing the region. And currently, she's involved in several research initiatives focused around financing nationally determined contributions, NDCs across the region, and unlocking new sources of climate finance, including blended public and private capital, private sector finance, and some of the more innovative ones like debt for climate swaps, bonds, carbon markets, etc. So, Dr. Mohan, we're really great to have you here, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about the role of budgeting in the climate finance equation and how it can be more climate responsive. So, over to you. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Anchor, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to thank CANARI for the opportunity to present today on the very important topic of climate finance, with a particular look at climate budgeting. So my presentation is entitled Climate Finance and Climate Budgeting in Caribbean SIDS. And so I want to kick off by talking about the Paris Agreement and climate finance. So as we may all be aware, the Paris Agreement calls for financial assistance from developed countries that industrialize first, with more financial resources, to less developed countries, which are still in the phase, which are still developing, but we are disproportionately affected by climate change. Now, the UNFCCC requires that developed countries provide finance that is new. It also requires that developed countries provide finance that is additional to developing countries. This is separate and apart from aid or ODA, official development assistance, where developed countries would normally provide finance. So we're saying that climate finance should not be replaced by ODA, but climate finance should in fact be new and additional. Now, where do we as SIDS, small island developing states, fit into the Paris Agreement and climate finance? Well, we've been able to list ourselves as especially vulnerable, as a vulnerable group, and we call for our efficient access to climate finance. Now, when talking about climate finance, we need to talk about the climate finance gap. And going back to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in 2009 is where it was first proposed to quantify our climate financing goal, so our global climate financing goal. And at this conference, it was agreed that developed countries would mobilize $30 billion US for the period 2010 to 2012. And then later on at COP, it was agreed that developed countries would mobilize US $100 billion per year from 2020. Now, this $100 billion per year from 2020, this goal has actually not been realized. Now, if we want to look at the total climate finance that was actually realized as of 2020, we have an estimate of US $640 billion being provided. So we see a significant financial gap out there in terms of financing our climate adaptation and mitigation. So as of 2021, we see that the financing needs identified in the NDCs, or the national determined contributions of 78 countries, amounted to about $5.8 trillion. This is an estimate until the period 2030, where these goals should be achieved, which equates to about $600 billion per year. So of course, this falls, the $100 billion that was promised, and then the $640 billion that was received falls way short of this target if we are to meet our climate financing goals. And I need to emphasize that the NDC targets, this 5.8 trillion targets adaptation projects as well as mitigation projects. it actually does not target what we're now calling loss and damage. So the loss and damage fund is currently in the process of being operationalized, and loss and damage finance is finance specific to disasters or immediate impacts from climate-induced weather, as well as the slow onset events from climate change. So this 5.8 trillion is still a significant underestimate of what we actually need in terms of our climate financing needs. Now, there is no consensus on how developed countries are going to share the responsibility for financing our climate finance goal. There's no clear roadmap to realize the annual US 100 billion per year. And as I said, the loss and damage fund is still currently being operationalized. Now, looking at the climate finance literature, climate finance in the literature is still very much an ambiguous and diverse term. It's also politically contentious. But in general, it refers to that local, national, and transnational financing from public and private sources, as well as other sources to support mitigation and adaptation. And of course, now we are now included into the equation loss and damage. It's still very much an emerging area of study. It's still an area where we're trying to get a handle of the mechanics in terms of the quantities. As I said, I gave some estimates of the supply and demand of international climate finance. We're still trying to estimate those needs, the demand and supply of it properly. Also, there are a whole lot of institutional, political, socioeconomic factors still being studied in terms of understanding climate finance and its impact. Now, a significant share of our climate finance still comes in the form of official development assistance. In fact, 80% of the financing reported by countries to the UNFCCC for the period 2010 to 2012 was in fact ODA. Now, you'd recall in the beginning, I said that the Paris Agreement stated that climate finance should be new and additional. But from what we're seeing in the literature, climate finance is sort of replacing official development assistance. Now, there's no international body that tracks climate finance or coordinates climate finance, and that exists for ODA. And this makes it difficult for us, as I said, to quantify and understand where climate finance is going. Now, the OECD calls for increased clarity on how the international community counts our public and private financial flows that would support climate activities. And this would help us to know if we're actually meeting that 100 billion target. Now, let's look at climate finance closer to home. So we're looking at climate finance in SIDS. And we will see that climate finance to SIDS globally represents just 2.2% of our total climate funds, despite small island developing states being, particularly vulnerable to climate change. And despite small island developing states contributing less than 1% of total greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of the geographic spread of climate finance, we would see that Pacific SIDS received the largest share of climate finance from multilateral climate funds. They received 47%. Now, this is followed by the Caribbean, where we received 34%. And this is then followed by the Africa, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China Sea, which accounted for 19%. Now, looking at climate finance in terms of adaptation and mitigation, we see that the majority of climate finance goes towards adaptation. In SIDS, 54%, and this is no surprise given our vulnerability to climate disasters. And we see that 24% of our climate finance goes to mitigation type projects. Now, in our region in the Caribbean, we are seeing a closing of the gap where mitigation finance is actually approaching similar levels of adaptation finance. It's however important for us to understand that we live in a very vulnerable region where we're impacted by hurricanes and tropical storms quite frequently, and it's important that we invest in adaptation strategies. Now, climate finance in SIDS face a lot of hurdles in terms of us being able to access climate finance in these multilateral development funds or through bilateral partners. And there are several reasons outlined for this in the literature. The main one being the complex requirements and processes to access these funds. So oftentimes you need to put in technical proposals of projects in order to access these funds. And we often lack the capacity to write these proposals. There are also other factors that constrain us in terms of our institutional and policy constraints. So once we've been able to successfully access the funds, implementing the funds can then become a problem in terms of our institutional framework. Oftentimes, we rely on a single provider, so most of our finance comes from a bilateral funder, and this reliance on a single provider can limit us in terms of the quantity of funding we receive. Oftentimes, when we receive climate funding, we fragment the funding across a large number of projects across several sectors. And this can sometimes reduce the impact of the projects. Also, we have limited public budget support from the region. So oftentimes our governments are constrained in terms of the finance that they can support. And sometimes international climate finance may require some public support for funding the projects. Also, most of our access to climate finance goes after short-term funding rather than securing long-term funding. And of course, sometimes we feel as SIDS that we do not have a voice in the international financial institutions in terms of how decisions are made, in terms of access to climate finance, where it goes, what projects are being funded. So, as I said, there are a limited number of studies which actually evaluate the effectiveness of climate finance in terms of how we are meeting our goals and how we are accessing these funds. Of course, in the region, we are doing our part to try to bridge this gap. Some of my studies in particular have looked at the NDCs and how we are funding our adaptation and mitigation goals. So I'm actually going to go into some of my research here and speak about the Caribbean in particular. So in my research, I make the case that the Caribbean SIDS are in fact a special case among SIDS globally. Among Caribbean SIDS, we are mainly classified as high or upper middle income countries. And given that a large share of climate finance still comes from bilateral aid channels, this high income status often restricts our access to international climate finance. This high income status also makes us not eligible for concessional finance from donors like the World Bank. Also, we are a very heavily indebted region. We are also a very climate vulnerable region. We are very disaster prone. As I said, we experience frequent hurricanes. And these frequent hurricanes, along with our low fiscal space, creates this low growth, high debt trap that we've been stuck in for almost 2 decades. And now following these disaster events, because of our high income status again, we are oftentimes restricted in terms of our access to international aid and international debt relief. So what I do in these studies is that I try to estimate our climate finance needs. So if we are to implement our mitigation and adaptation projects in the region, how much money would we require? And to do this, I look at the NDCs, the national determined contributions of Caribbean countries. And in looking at the NDCs where projects are listed, I'm able to see where countries would have listed their mitigation needs and their adaptation needs. And we see that 8 countries actually provided estimates of mitigation, which amounted to $23.1 billion. 5 countries provided estimates of their adaptation, which amounted to $28 billion. And we had one country, Grenada, giving an aggregate estimate of $0.2 billion. Now, if we were to add these up, this gives us a total cost of about $51 billion. So if we are to achieve our climate goals by 2030, as stated in our NDCs, we would require $51 billion US, or just about 40% of our regional GDP. And of course, this is very much an underestimate because not all of the countries in this study would have actually provided estimates of their adaptation and mitigation goals. Also, countries that provided estimates have actually not costed all of their adaptation and mitigation goals. And again, lastly, this does not include funding for loss and damage. So funding to build our capacity when a disaster strikes, so relief cleanup after disaster strike, or the slow onset of climate change. So this does not capture all of our climate financing needs, but it's the closest we have in terms of coming up with an estimate. Now, looking at the climate finance needs, we see that there is heterogeneity among the countries in the region. So we see the larger, poorer islands require more finance than the smaller islands. So Haiti actually takes up the majority of the share of the climate finance required, 49%, followed by the Dominican Republic with 34%, sorry. Now, if we were to look at the climate finance gap for the region, if we look historically at what we've received in terms of the supply of climate finance, we would see that over the period 2010 to 2015, $1.3 billion would have been received in terms of international climate finance. And this represents just 2.6% of our needs. So the amount we received from 2010 to 2015 is actually just 2.6% of what we need going forward until 2030 to achieve our climate finance goals based on the estimates that we provided. So we see that there's a significant climate finance gap in the region in terms of how we're going to finance our climate action. Looking at the type of financing, well, the majority of the financing was actually provided in the form of grants, 62%, whereas 38% came as loans. And we may say, okay, this is a good number. We have more grants than loans. But if we look at other SIDS globally, you would see that their loan figures for climate action is actually much lower than 38%. So that 38% debt funding is actually a high figure in terms of funding our climate action. Now, looking at the indices again, there's a heavy reliance on international climate finance to finance our climate action. Again, this is no surprise given the limited fiscal space in the region and the high debt in the region. But today we want to talk about public finance, and we want to talk about climate budgeting. So governments do have a role to play in terms of financing their climate adaptation and mitigation goals. In examining the NDCs, however, we see that governments across the region hardly mention the use of public finance in financing their climate goals. We see that only the Bahamas, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines actually mention using public finance. What we also see is there's hardly any mention of fiscal policy reform. So there's hardly any mention of removing subsidies for fossil fuels, for instance, or having environmental taxes. Now, countries may have plans to implement these, but they probably were not captured in the NDCs. But based on the NDC reports, that is, we're seeing very low fiscal incentives to move away from fossil fuels and the implementation of environmental taxes. So again, very few countries noted the importance of this misalignment between using our fiscal policies to achieve our climate goals. So fiscal policies are oftentimes tied to our sustainable development goals in our budget, but we also want to go a little bit further in that we want to tie our fiscal policies to our climate finance goals or our climate action, our adaptation action, our mitigation action. And again, there's hardly any mention in our NDCs of tying our budgets and our fiscal policies to climate action. Now, in terms of climate budgeting and the literature around it, it's something fairly new, again, newer than climate finance. And it's now beginning to take shape. Here at SALISES, we've actually undertaken a project in terms of climate budgeting across the region. And in that project, we're actually going to map the climate budgeting best practices as some of the countries in the region I can identify, Antigua and Barbuda and Dominica, are implementing currently. And what that project does is to identify and map these climate budgeting best practices. So there is a growing call to integrate climate considerations and climate action into public finances. We are increasingly recognizing that governments and ministries of finance play a crucial role in channeling funds towards adaptation and mitigation. Currently, there's a high degree of uncertainty about climate finance allocation and expenditures in developing countries and in SIDS because of a lack of proper frameworks and procedures. Also, mitigation and adaptation activities are often cross-cutting in that they're scattered across a number of ministries. So oftentimes the Ministry of Environment will implement environment projects, and the Ministry of Finance may be excluded as to what is taking place on the ground in that ministry responsible for environmental projects. So climate budgeting really serves as a strategic tool for aligning government policies with their climate and environmental considerations and commitments, geared towards building a sustainable, equitable, and resilient society. Now, developing countries face difficulty in allocating, tracking, and evaluating climate-related expenditures, and this is exactly what climate budgeting intends to do. Ministries of Finance also lack the knowledge, skills, and frameworks to integrate climate considerations and actions into their public financial management processes and their national budgets. And climate budgeting, again, is coming up with the tools to help us to be able to track this climate expenditure and allocation. Now, there are several key features in climate budgeting to help us do this. First one being integrations. We want to incorporate climate considerations into national budgets and public financial management systems. We also want to take a systematic approach in that we want to direct resources and incentives towards achieving national climate commitments. We want to ensure a governance system that mainstreams climate commitments into decision-making. We want to be able to track, so we want to be able to identify and monitor climate-related allocations and expenditures. And we also want to be able to collect data. So data collection. So we want to be able to assign tags to budget items for mitigation and adaptation. How is the money being spent? What are the projects? Through data collection, we can ensure that the climate finance is actually meeting the community level, the individuals on the ground, ensuring that the money, there is transparency and accountability in how the money is being used in terms of the projects being implemented by NGOs, etc.
So, Priya, so just a 1 minute warning.
Sure. So this is my last slide in terms of the benefits, which would have been kind of obvious from what I said before. So we can track our progress, so we can assess progress towards meeting our climate goals through climate budgeting. It helps with informed decisions, so we can inform our investment decisions, climate investment decisions. It helps to align our climate and development priorities. It helps with enhancing transparency and accountability. And of course, all of this helps with increasing our international access to climate finance. because it positions us in terms of transparency for donors, in terms of delivering climate finance to us. So I'll end it here and go take questions.
Okay, so thank you very much for that, Priya. I think that was very useful to have that context surrounding climate finance, what our needs are, but then what's the role that public finance can play and why climate budgeting can be this very useful tool. I think that was very helpful and a really nice overview of the issues and how we can approach it. And maybe just to note that Priya unfortunately can't stay for the whole session. She has to run off for another commitment. So if people have burning questions, ask them now. We have 2-3 minutes before we move to the next speaker and before she has to leave. So, put up your hand, put stuff in the chat. If you have anything that you want clarification on, or you just want you have a really interesting question you want to ask. So I'm not seeing any hands up yet. Oh, there's a question. So Sarah, do you want to ask it, or I can just read out your question? Okay, she says go ahead. So Sarah's asking, are there Caribbean countries currently using the Climate Public Expenditure and Institutional Review CPEIR methodology?
So thank you for that question. So I'm not fully aware of the methodology, but it's some kind of climate public expenditure review. As I said, we're now looking at the climate budgeting initiatives across the region. And from what we've seen so far in the cases of Antigua and Dominica is a sort of mentioning of they're now deriving the tools for climate budgeting rather than having these frameworks in place. So I would say, based on limited knowledge at the moment, I don't think that climate public expenditure institutional review methodology is being used from the documents that we looked at. But again, from the project, we would then we would be interviewing the stakeholders. So maybe at that stage, when we start interviewing the technocrats in the ministries of finance, we may learn that this is actually being used, but not yet documented. So I don't want to give an answer of no. But for now, based on documents, no. But as this study rolls out, hopefully we can uncover things like this.
Okay, fantastic. There's also another question from Christina in the chat, and also Lisa, I see your hand is up. So we'll come to you just now. So one question is, what are the benefits of including finance needs in the NDC? And will countries still be able to apply for additional grant funding for actions if not included in the NDC?
The NDCs are basically just our climate goals, and they're, of course, voluntary since signing the Paris Agreement. But what the NDCs does, it gives legitimacy to our adaptation and mitigation action. So the better we are able to cost our adaptation and mitigation action, then we can give some sort of credibility to our donors that this is the project, these are the estimates, and so that can help in terms of a donor deciding, okay, I'm going to make this money be accessible to you. So costing of our goals, our NDC goals, provides that confidence to donors. It improves transparency and accountability. So again, the NDCs, because of our limited domestic resources, our NDCs are conditional international climate finance. And the first thing donors would want to see is transparency and accountability. And they want to have the estimates of the projects to be implemented. So the better we are able to break down our projects and provide estimates of costs, then that actually increases our chances of attracting international climate finance for our projects. There was also one about if a project is not included in the NDC, if we can apply for funding. Definitely, because the NDCs are not meant to capture everything. They are voluntary, as I said, and it's basically just a roadmap of our climate goals and ambitions going forward.
Okay. Lisa, do you want to ask your question?
Less of a question and more of a comment and a response to Sarah. They are actually public expenditure reviews that have been done by the IMF and the World Bank that look at disaster risk finance. They've been around for a little while, so probably about 2019, 2020, but they are useful. I think the challenge is that they need to be mainstreamed and applied across the board and picked up. So they've been done mostly as fiscal and finance reviews, but they do exist because I've looked at several of them. And so that's probably an opportunity for Pri and her team to kind of dig into those, but they're actually quite useful. There's summary versions of them that actually point out where the strengths and weaknesses are in the public finance system and where countries need to work on. The challenge, as you know, is have we worked on them? And just to add that Grenada actually has also started to do as part of its budget, a listing and an analysis of how much of its budget is going to climate finance issues, whether it's from external funding or domestic funding. So there are little bits of work that are going on across the board in a number of different countries, and it may be how they're appearing, but there are efforts ongoing.
So just to build on Lisa's point, from my research out of the NDCs, to say that the finding was that public expenditure is actually quite low and governments are not aligning their climate goals with their sustainable goals. I found that to be somewhat a distorted reality, because given that we live in a region that is highly climate vulnerable, I do believe that a lot of the public expenditure is going towards climate projects. But because the language of climate is not used in our public frameworks, our public financial management frameworks, it's not being captured as such, and we're not looking like good citizens out there for our donors. And this is the importance of climate budgeting, because if we bring the framework into our reporting, into our fiscal accounts, then we're able to prove that to donors. A donor might say, why are you not invested in climate? Why should I invest in climate if you, as a government, you're not invested in climate? We would better be able to track the funding towards climate projects and show donors we are in fact investing, and give them that confidence to then invest in our projects as well. So this is to make the point of why I see climate budgeting being very, very important for us right now. And it's something we really need to assess across the region and create the tools to ensure that we are actually the frameworks and the tools to implement across the region to show that we are tracking our climate expenditure and allocation.
Okay, so thanks for that clarification. I think that was very useful to hear and to think about. That is sort of like hidden expenditure that we're not really tracking effectively and capturing. There was one very quick question, which might be easy for you to answer before you go. So someone's asking for clarity on whether loans are included in part of climate finance. How would you define that?
Yes, loans are actually definitely included in part of climate finance. So we shouldn't be misguided to think that all climate finance comes as as grants, sorry, because multilateral financing is captured in there in climate finance, and those are actual loans that we need to repay.
Yes, and the sad truth is that I think we get more loans than we do grants. So yeah, so I think those are all of the questions that I see right now, and I know that you have to go. So maybe we'll end it here. And I'll just say, a really big thank you. We really appreciated you taking the time, and your presentation was very insightful. And I'll just follow up and make sure it's okay to share the slides, etc., with everybody, and any other materials if there's research that you want us to attach in the follow-up email, etc.
So definitely the slides can be shared, and the studies that I presented, I can also share those as well. So maybe through CANARI, you can share it to your audience.
Yes, will do. Okay, fantastic. So thanks very much, Priya. Have a great rest of the day. And it was great having you.
Thank you,
Before Priya
everyone.
goes, they're asking for your email as well, actually.
Sure.
Okay, so with that, I will introduce our next speaker. So we have Lisa Perch. CEO and founder of Saedi Consulting based in Barbados. She's an international development expert with over 20 years of experience in climate change, poverty reduction, the inclusive green economy, and gender policy and mainstreaming. She's well published and she's worked across the globe from Latin America to Africa and more recently in Asia. And of course, she's worked on Caribbean SIDS issues for most of her career. So she will be talking about the sort of gender responsive, inclusive kind of aspect of budgeting as a key consideration in this discussion, and how that can help contribute to a more just and equitable climate finance. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Ainka, and good afternoon, everyone. Fascinating and great to hear the work that Priya is doing, and glad that we have some additional insights coming into finance. As Ainka would have said, what I'm going to be looking at is really the fact that in addition to climate budgeting, we also need to make sure that it's gender responsive, not just looking at the needs of women, but looking at intersectional needs and looking at the needs of specific vulnerable groups. In other words, not only how much money are we getting, but what are we doing with it and who is benefiting? And so this is one of the reasons for the focus on budgeting, because finance tends to focus on the financial flows and maybe where they're being allocated in broad terms to adaptation and mitigation, but they don't necessarily get into the weeds of, where are the funds being allocated, and how are people benefiting? And at the end of the day, that's really part of the critical focus for us to be able to improve our resilience, but also enhance our adaptation and even advance our mitigation. Next slide, please. And so as I look at that, elements of justice become very important. And so I want to start off and center what I will say, in a number of issues, considering what we understand and even work that we're doing in Saedi Consulting in the Caribbean region. One of the areas we spend a lot of time working on is agriculture and food security, which usually links into nutritional security, but also brings in issues of water and energy. And we know that when we're doing that work, that we need to consider some of the differentiated needs, not just by sex, but by age. And even when we talk about women, that we talk about specific types of women. Are we talking about women farmers or women farm workers or women agro-processors? That's just an insight into some of the nuance that is critical in our region for making sure that not only are we budgeting effectively, but we're budgeting for the right people and for the right kind of impacts. When we understand also some of the trends that are ongoing, not just at the policy space, but also at the household level, particularly coming out of COVID-19, and we recognize that most people are making some investments to make sure they have some level of food that they have immediate control over, and that they can then also manage the cost of food, which we also know has increased significantly, not just from COVID-19, but also because of the Ukraine war and a number of other challenges. We recognize that part of our adaptation is not just for climate, but it's also because of economic plus climate pressures, plus additional challenges when it comes to issues like land degradation, soil loss, and biodiversity loss as well. And so part of what I'm talking about is also making sure that as we do our budgeting, we use both gender and climate as an entry point for really bringing the issues together to make sure that the budget is actually going to the right things. There's a challenge, of course, in sometimes splitting too many hairs, but given the small size of our economies and our countries, we need to make sure that the resources are actually targeting the right issues. We also want to make sure that we recognize and acknowledge that in our communities, in our sectors, we have both informal and informal roles as well as workers. And often when we think about how the public budget goes, we think about response to impacts from hurricanes or events, or we even think about how public budgeting goes to support national insurance, that often informal workers are often left to the side or sometimes left out completely. And I say this as we in Barbados are actually debating around some of the ways in which resources are being transferred to fishers and who's getting those resources and why. And it just raises the issue of making sure that we have a people kind of profile on some of the issues that we're looking at. I would have mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic as a very pivotal, critical issue. Remember that in addition to all of the debt that countries would have had, there is debt that also would have been accrued because of that pandemic as well. And at the same time that debt was occurring, governments were actually trying to find ways to provide social protection and other forms of support, meaning that the fiscal space in many of the countries is already very limited. So we recognize that if we're looking at this combination of issues and we're looking at Caribbean countries, small, medium, and not so small, that when we start looking at climate budgeting, we're also looking at the extent to which we can combine climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and domestic as well as international financing to make sure that it's actually going to the places it needs to go, and that we have actors who are able to receive those resources, to implement it, and also to report on what they've achieved. When we recognize that funding being allocated separately is problematic, it splits the impact, but it also diverts sometimes resources in ways that are not productive and sometimes even perverse. It really brings us to the conclusion that we really need to enhance how we're thinking about resources and how we're also thinking about budgeting. And budgeting, while we will focus a lot on the public sector, it also means thinking about those internationally publicly financed projects that we have and how we're doing the budgeting there and how we're ensuring allocations across a number of issues, but also how we're monitoring and reporting on impact. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at this, we recognize that in addition to all of the funds that we already have, and Priya would have mentioned those, in terms of the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, and we have bilateral and multilateral sources. We also have increasing work in the space of climate and disaster risk insurance and finance. And then we also have the discussions around loss and damage, and where those will fit. What we recognize is at a broad level, adaptation finance, the needs are much bigger than we currently have in terms of finance flows. Even when we see that a lot of money is going to adaptation and mitigation, there's still quite a significant gap. For example, Barbados would have mentioned today that it signed a debt for data swap around debt vulnerability, and yet at the same time would have said that it has needs of 1.8 trillion. And that's just Barbados alone, in a region that has about 15 countries, all with similar needs and certainly at factors that may be even much higher than that. And what we then recognize is that we also need to think about how we manage the resources that are available while advocating for additional resources, but that we also have a plan for how we're going to implement those resources and apply them to priorities at the national, sectoral, and even local level. Next slide, please. And here just recognizing that, sometimes the way that we also have to look at resources is where they're going. So we have that money, we have needs, but sometimes resources are also going in specific directions. And to be honest, sometimes those directions are often about perhaps what is easiest for people to see and to measure, but it's also about sometimes what is the hot topic of the day. I'm not saying that coastal flooding is not important, but we have 1 billion invested in coastal flooding adaptations, while recognizing that in our region, 80% of our infrastructure is in the coastal area. How much really could 1 billion possibly do? And we recognize at the same time that we're also losing our biodiversity at astronomical rates, and they are going to be much more effective than anything that we can do at a physical, infrastructure level in terms of protecting that coastal infrastructure and thereby protecting investments as well as lives. And so it's important to recognize how we can use what we also have to make sure that it has impacts across other sectors where possible. And as I said, that we actually get to the nitty-gritty of some of the issues as well that end up having knock-on effects on persons doing things that then require us to need more finance. Next slide, please. So if we look at Hurricane Beryl, for example, just to give us a sense of some of the scale. So we know some of the estimates already, but this is just one hurricane, and this is the one hurricane that we've had a major impact from in 2024. And already just for Jamaica, we're talking about 29.8 million, and we're talking about other millions of dollars for St. Vincent as well as Grenada. And some of these are infrastructural, but some of them are also about residential, and some of them are about agriculture. And these scales of finance are well beyond what countries are generating in terms of GDP. But even beyond that, if you take away the debt payments and other issues, they just don't have the scale of resources to be able to cover these. And so this is where this tension between our vulnerability and the impacts come in. Also want to flag here that sometimes when it's important to look at the budgets of countries. I remember looking at the budget of St. Vincent not this year, but last year. And they were still putting a budget in for an event that had happened 6 or 7 years ago. So when we think of budgeting, we also have to think about the fact that there are recurrent costs arising from events, small or large. And that is also part of the budgeting conundrum that's facing countries in the region, and also the ways in which we allocate those resources and try to do so equitably and justly. Next slide, please. When we look at understanding and supporting our beneficiaries, therefore, it's really important to have an intersectional lens and to really be able to think about how we're going to support women, female-headed households, elderly people, youth and children, persons with disabilities, indigenous and tribal people, agricultural workers, and men. And those are just a few of the groups. I could add homeless people, etc. But that is the nature of the challenge that we have. And this is why budgeting becomes important, because it's not just about what the climate ministry is going to do or even the finance ministry is going to do. A critical aspect of this is how we make sure that the budgeting that's already happening in a social ministry, for example, combines with this funding and also builds on it, and also takes some of that funding to be able to make sure that we deliver in a way that reduces the vulnerabilities with these groups that then have a cost and then require additional resources within an already strained, limited budget. And so here you see some of the issues that we have to look at in terms of asset building, in terms of education, and making sure persons understand climate risk. Governance is a very important issue. And if you look at some of the work that the IMF and the World Bank have done around public finance expenditure, one of the big gaps is around governance. And that includes what Priya was talking about in terms of the tagging, the accountabilities, the reporting, and the knowing where the money went, but critically, what was achieved and who benefited from it. Next slide, please. So when we look at climate finance, there are a number of things that are going on right now, and a lot of them are within this sphere. And so you look at the fact that governance and institutional mechanisms are there, they're key. If you have the money, but you don't know how you're managing the money, if you don't know where the money's going, you don't know who's accounting for the money, you don't know what kind of impact you're going, it still means that our climate finance is still somewhat inefficient. We also recognize that in our region, we need to strengthen our recovery process. We're doing that now for Beryl, but some countries are still recovering from impacts 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 7 years ago. And recovery, therefore, is an ongoing process that has an intense need for resources. It really brings together a whole bunch of actors at the public sector level. But then we need to look at how we invest with other resources, how we look at the private sector, for example, through gender lens investing, but also how we manage environmental and social and climate risk, as I said, to reduce the ways in which that erodes the limited resources we already have. And so this is an important context in just packaging how we look at climate finance, and that it's not just about the flows. Flows are great, but there are other elements of this that we also need to consider as well in terms of managing that finance and getting the maximum impact we can from every dollar that we have, either domestically or that we received externally. Next slide, please. I just want to pitch a flag here for climate and disaster risk insurance, because this has become a very pivotal issue. And as you can imagine, in order to get insurance, you need finance to buy it. But insurance becomes important to be able to get back finance in hand when you need it post a disaster, and to be able to cover some issues yourself. And so when we look at the public sector, I'm also thinking of the wider national context and domestic context, in the fact that all of us have a role to play, not just government, in terms of how we plan and we allocate resources to climate change. It's important to look at government's role, but we all have to do our role, our part. Government alone will not be able to do it. And so that means that we need to look at the role of finance as well as insurance in terms of asset building and addressing issues of asset poverty that we know affect our region. It means we need to look at issues of underinsurance as well, and how people are also doing their household budgeting alongside some of the public inputs and expenditures they need to make. It means that we also need to look at how we manage, understand, and value assets, particularly when we're looking at sectors like fisheries or agriculture, and how those are supported, those are protected, and that we then allow persons to be able to return, if it were to business and to income generation, so that they can then be part of the process themselves. And in some ways, it then reduces the kind of burden that they may have on the public purse not just in terms of the actual amounts, but the amount of time that they may need that kind of social assistance from the public sector. Next slide, please. So when we come to gender responsive budgeting, this is, as Priya would have said, even newer. It's gender responsive budgeting has been around for a long time. And what I've been working on, and did this for UN Women, was actually looking at how we leverage gender responsive budgeting that's already ongoing in the region and leverage that for the newer consideration of climate budgeting and look at ways to combine them. We have limited human resources, we have limited capacities, we have limited data, and we have limited time in many ways. And so the approach was to try to combine these two and to really look, therefore, at how we could come up with something that would really deliver on both sides and also make sure that we were able to track and we're able to tag. So in the past, when we've looked at gender responsive budgeting, we've been looking at budgeting approaches, mechanisms, systems that work for everybody. And that they do so by looking and making sure that we have distributions and allocations of resources that match priorities, that basically our money follows what we say are our priorities and that we walk our talk. When we now look to make that shift to gender responsive climate budgeting, we're looking at building on that and really now bringing in climate considerations, particularly where gender and climate really intersect, to really strengthen those existing mechanisms and therefore make sure that we have a responsive budgeting system, we have responsive budgeting practices, and we have mechanisms also that allow us to be flexible and adaptive to emerging challenges and escalating needs. Next slide, please. And so quickly, some GRB principles that you have no gender mainstreaming without climate mainstreaming. So it's not choosing between the two, it's the fact that they're both important, particularly if you're in the Caribbean region. We're looking at increasing accountability so we know where money is, where it's going, who manages it, who's reporting on it, and what the responsibilities are. We want to make sure there's meaningful participation by all sectors, including NGOs and CSOs and the public, because we need to have that kind of shadow reporting, but we also need to have that accountability to the public about where resources have gone and who has been helped. We want to make sure that we include formal and informal actors, as I would have mentioned before, but we also want to make sure that we do our best to address equity between groups and within sectors. This doesn't mean that everybody gets the same amount. It means that whoever, that on an annual basis, based on what you know and based on the needs, that you allocate the resources to make sure that you maintain, maintenance is key, but you also address escalating acute needs, and you also support and plan for future challenges that may be coming, and that's the role of social protection. I won't be able to get into that a lot today, but it's important that when we think about our resilience building, that we think about where our social protection budgets are going to go and should be going. It means that we need to think about partnerships with public and non-public investments, and we also need to think about the role of the public themselves. The public is not just the victim here, the public is also a beneficiary, but also an actor, and also has a lot to contribute to this, including what is needed and when. We also want to make sure we think about accounting and monitoring that is participatory, but that we also build in mechanisms that are about risk sharing, risk pooling, and benefit sharing. Those are usually where the governance issues lie and where often we fall down on what we should be doing in terms of making sure that we are dissipating that risk. We're not passing it on to the poorest and most vulnerable or the voiceless, which is often what we do, that we're pooling risks as well to also, again, support that risk sharing, but that we also have mechanisms for benefit sharing. And usually that is where you come post-event, post-disaster, or in the project, we want to make sure that we carry on those principles in terms of who's getting the benefits. And we want to make sure that we also understand what smart claims and benefits could look like. Again, we often use these terms, but we often have not defined them. And we don't say what this means, and we don't think about what this means when you have competing needs and conflicting, potentially, use of resources as well. We have not defined these issues. And so it's not a surprise that our budgeting remains weak in some areas. And so it's important to think about these principles, and these were the ones that were developed under the Engender project to really kind of begin to move this process forward in practical ways towards implementation and application as well as learning. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we can do this, and I'm going to try to go through this quickly, there are a number of things that we need to think about. Some of these are gendered principles or things that we know from our gender work. Increased engagement is important, not just for vulnerable groups, but it's going to be also for the climate ministry and the finance ministry. It's for the NGOs and it's for the private sector. Again, we kind of have strengths in all of these areas, but we've not necessarily always been consistent at bringing them all together. And it's going to be important to have a whole of society approach to address this enormous need and this evolving need. We also know that given the space of shocks and the kinds of shocks that we experience, that we need rapid response and we need flexible financing instruments. And sometimes this is where we have more control domestically. And perhaps this is where we not only think about our public finance budgeting systems, but our relationships with the commercial banking system and with the credit unions, for example, to think about what are some of the flexible financing instruments that could allow us to be able to respond and that allow us to budget knowing that we have those needs. And we also know who's going to implement those kind of strategies if they're needed. Critical in all of
Sorry,
this.
Lisa. So just a 1-minute warning.
Thank you. And so critical in this also is understanding that we also need to be able to track and to be able to account for what we do. And so there are a couple of things that I'm just going to go over very quickly in terms of the gender marker, as well as the allocation system that I think is important for us to start thinking about how we do this on a very practical level. Next slide, please. The allocation tool, this is just an example of one of the ways in which you can think about your annual budget and think about the needs that you have, and also think about what you're going to be allocating for agriculture, fisheries, gender, climate, and also secondary focus areas in a way because of the fact that they take up all of these, but they also are impacted by them, and actually start allocating in that way, understanding the intersections of these. This is just one way we've proposed doing this, to think about making sure that there's actually a thinking process and a documented process, and then it allows you to be able to track and to be able to report on how the resources were allocated and also what the intent was behind them. Next slide. This is the gender marker and the gender climate marker. What we've done here is to adapt the gender marker framework to include climate change and given some directions in terms of if you're looking at a project, if you're looking at your annual budget, as you review this budget, how do you know whether you're meeting your goals and whether you need to send it back to someone to be able to make some improvements? And so here is some guidance in terms of how you would rate your budget and then what that may help to trigger in terms of being able to improve or to be able to identify where you may need additional support, capacity, as well as maybe even finance to be able to do better. And so see you here, we start with 0, where you're not doing a lot that looks at gender and climate. Then we move to 1, where there's some acknowledgement, but there's still additional work that could be done. Next slide, please. Then you have 2, where you start to do a little bit more. You have clear gender objectives, indicators, and expected results. You have 3, where you start looking at now, you're bringing your gender budget with more gender climate results as well together. And then last but not least, 4, the ultimate that we could try to achieve is where we see a clear climate and gender budget statement. And you have detailed indicators, you know what you're verifying and how, and you have an action plan and outcomes. And usually there you also have responsibilities. So Grenada has done a little bit of work where it has a gender budget statement and it has a climate budget statement. Now the opportunity there is to kind of bring some of those together. Antigua has done some really good analysis on how it's using its budget, and it's got the SURF, but now part of the opportunity is to think about how do you translate that into the budget system in a more tangible, and operational way. I'll stop there, but I look forward to the questions, and if we need to go into more, there are slides that talk about gender lens investing, which is important, I think, for the private sector engagement, and we also have some links to some tools, including the gender responsive climate budgeting guidance document that I would have mentioned. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much for that, Lisa. I think that was very informative, and I think you raised a lot of really interesting issues that I'm not sure we're always taking into account, reflecting on when we think about budgeting and climate finance. I particularly like that circle graphic that you had with the climate finance in the middle and all of the different dimensions and things that we need to be considering as part of that. Which I think is kind of a nice snapshot of all of the things that we really need to be advocating, reflecting on, thinking about how we can shift in relation to, more just, inclusive, gender responsive kind of financing in general. So I will open up the floor for any questions that people have. So feel free to raise your hands or to write your questions in the chats. I definitely think we can, take at least 7 minutes for a Q&A with Lisa before we open up for general plenary discussion. So,
Sure.
just jump in with any questions that you have. Maybe while people are thinking, I'll take the prerogative.
Sure.
And
I see you
ask,
ready to jump in there.
yeah, ask about the gender lens investing, which you actually didn't get to in your presentation, but maybe you could say a little bit about it.
Well, I can pop back up the slide now with Sonali support. So gender lens investment is a relatively newer area, but it's one that's grown over time. And it's where we think about how investors invest in ways that enable investment finance to go towards women, women's needs, women-led companies, gender responsive solutions to climate change and to issues of energy is what I would say. This is a global movement, and one of probably the premier or more visible actors is 2X Global. We actually were at a kickoff meeting with them today, and we're going to be doing some research looking at some of these issues in the context of energy. And we know that while the Caribbean has limited impact and limited capacity in this area, there is still capacity there. And so there's been work that's been done by UN Women. I think there's some work being done by the government of Bahamas as well, looking at opportunities by Portland Equity, et cetera, looking at where the opportunities might be to stimulate an interest in gender as well as climate or a derivative of climate, and to put our money where our mouths are. And so this is an opportunity, I think, for individuals particularly, as well as governments, to be able to be more active in this space. It also, I think, is an opportunity for the diaspora to be engaged. We often talk about the diaspora, but we've not yet ever, I think, really come up with real proper instruments to help the diaspora to be able to do what it does. Yes, we have, the calls for funds and the GoFundMe's post a disaster, but what are we doing on an ongoing basis to enable the diaspora to help and support our investment in our long-term resilience? And so there are some instruments and there's some opportunities there, but we still need to be able to build on these a little bit more. And as I said, we're doing some work around this on energy for the Latin American and Caribbean region. And it gives us an opportunity to be able to think about, what do we need to think about in terms of not just thinking about how we are able to monitor and measure these impacts, but how are we able to make sure that the investment is actually delivering on the gender responsive as well as the climate responsive impacts and outcomes that we need. And so I'll just say that very quickly, but happy to follow if you have any follow-up questions, Ainka or anybody else on gender lens investing.
So thanks so much for that, Lisa. I think that was really interesting, and it's great to see that there are some initiatives happening around this. So I guess I need to brush up on what's happening here, because I wasn't
I would
aware of
just
all of
add, it's also an opportunity for women to be the force that they can be as investors and financiers. And so there are actually quite a few active women financing groups around gender lens investing that has also enabled them to be much more visible actors and to be able to put money towards things that they're interested in.
Okay, fantastic. So I don't want to hog the floor. So people put up your hands or put your questions in the chat, so we can, ask questions to the lovely Lisa while we have her here.
But do you have
So
any other
while we
questions
wait,
for
maybe
me?
I'll ask another question. Yeah, I might have another question for you. So maybe, do you have an example of where citizens or NGOs have been very actively engaged in the budgeting process or try to influence or serve as a watchdog or something? Because I think that's, for me, one of the things that I feel people feel very removed from the budgeting process. It's a very complicated process. It's often kind of, shrouded in lots of technical language. You have to go to parliament or whatever it is, negotiate. So people feel very intimidated. And so I guess having a sense of, how people are actually engaging in the budgeting process and trying to shape all of those things that you're talking about would be interesting. And I know that there are a couple of people in the audience who may be able to jump in after this and talk about it. I'm seeing Ingrid Parchment, but a few other people, maybe from the Jamaican crew, who did some participatory budgeting, focus on forest management specifically. But I think, you know, some of that stuff could be relevant here as well for this discussion.
So I think that that goal or that focus and that principle is still a bit of a inspiration and an aspiration. But you know, you are aware in some countries where, you know, the budgets technically are made available for about what, 2 to 3 weeks every year. As you say, the problem is who actually goes in to read the 150 pages of the budget, who understands the budget and the implications of the budget, who's able to sit down and do the quick calculations on the allocations, etc., and then be able to come up with some, you know, specific things. I would say though that people perhaps should not be so shy. The fact is, a budget process is an open process, and if you've got questions, you put the questions on. You don't need to be an expert on the budget. If you know, even the querying and the interrogation of the budget, I think is an important aspect of making sure the budget is clear and making sure the budget is doing what people expect it to do. So I wouldn't worry so much about being, you know, a fiscal expert, you know, and being a finance expert. You know, the fact that the budget is not obvious and clear and easy for people to interpret is probably an issue in of itself. And so I think persons asking questions is useful. Now, I'm aware that there are some transitions like in Antigua and Barbuda and Grenada where, you know, you have a gender budget statement. There would have been some engagement, I believe, with the gender ministry perhaps, and they would have looked at the gender action plan to define some of those issues. But the extent to which NGOs would have been involved in detail in the budget and really been involved from the beginning, I don't know that we have necessarily a lot of very good examples of that. I know we've got some work on gender responsive budgeting where it's been a bit more participatory, but again, that has not always happened around the actual budgeting process. What we've tried to do is to do some of that work ahead of the budgeting process so that we inform and engage the parties so that they take on these issues. But I think we still need to work on getting that participatory budgeting process and seeing how it's going to work within the existing process that already exists for how the budget is done. I see that there are a couple of questions, and I think Christian has a hand up.
Yeah, so there's a question about the upcoming NDCs, and I assume this is because they have to be updated, I think by next year. So I know what opportunities are there for a gender lens to be integrated and for vulnerable groups to be more engaged.
There's a good opportunity because I think the NDC partnership is very focused on this issue and has given priority to this issue. And I think the UNFCCC Secretariat has also made this a bit of a priority. I know they did some work with the Commonwealth Secretariat reviewing a number of NDCs and looking at where they were strong on some issues and weak on others. I know that St. Kitts, for example, because we just applied for it, is actually doing some specific work with the support of the 5Cs on the gender responsive aspect of the NDC. And so there is a lot of potential. And it's really now to make sure that every country can take up that opportunity and that they get the kind of support that they need. But there is definitely a very tangible and real opportunity right now for that kind of work to be done. I think the gender lens and the vulnerability group lens is important, but it can't just be tangential and theoretical. I think it also means you have to have the analysis, you have to have the data, you have to have the stakeholder engagement. But critically, I would also say that if we want the NDC to be implemented in the spirit in which it's created, we need to build the capacities of those who are going to be implementing. We can't assume they understand gender and gender responsiveness and gender responsive climate budgeting or even climate budgeting. And so sometimes I think we make assumptions that are not borne out by fact. And so I think, and I'm seeing in some of the support coming that there is actually a tangible set of resources going to capacity building, to workshops, to tools and guidance and awareness building.
Okay, fantastic. And I think you sort of answered another question that was in the chat about building capacity. So maybe I'll let Kristen go ahead as she has her hand up.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the presentations today. I didn't hear everything you said, so I apologize if what I'm asking was said already, but the part I heard was very good. So thank you so much for that. So I was part of a project a couple years ago in St. Lucia. I think it was actually one of the first efforts to implement budget tagging here. So I can talk a little bit about that if you like. And I think one thing that people who haven't been, who are new to this topic or haven't been involved with it may not realize is that it seems kind of complicated, but what it actually is quite simple. It's just like if you're, you know, you have your home bank account and you're just saying like, I'm going to check every expenditure that was related to, you know, housing or something. So you can add them all up at the end of the year. But of course, the hard part is getting it all, you know, included in the processes and people understanding which things should be tagged and which shouldn't. But my question for you is, you've been using the term budget tracking today, and I don't think I've heard you say expenditure tracking, which I would argue perhaps is more important. And I know that on the government side, those two processes are quite different, right? So if you implement budget tracking, you're not necessarily implementing expenditure tracking. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, those two different things and which one you think is more important? And you've talked a little bit about the status of doing these kinds of initiatives in the region and maybe where people are with expenditure tracking versus budget tracking. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Kristen. So I guess I'm a bit of a finance purist. If you were expenditure tracking, you should have had a budget. That would be my first statement. You shouldn't be spending money without knowing what it was intending to do, because how would you be able to track the expenditure anyway? So for me, these two things are in sync. One tends to come before the other. And so when I talk about budget tracking, is because that's where I'm thinking that's where you're starting. And then when you are in the expenditure mode, when your budget is approved, then yes, you need to look at the expenditure tracking. And what I would have said is that key for me in the overall budgeting thing is, where did you spend the money? On whom did you spend it? And what did you achieve? And that's where the expenditure tracking stuff is really critical. And so for me, those two things are tightly woven. And it's very important that, yes, once you've had your budget, of course, changes will come about. No budget's perfect, things will happen. But the issue is still being able to know where you put your money. If you move the money, where did you move it and why? And that becomes the issue of documentation, not even tracking. That's more of a governance issue and accountability issue. And I would have flagged some of those issues before. But yes, that part is very key. What we've seen when we've looked at gender responsive budgeting, for example, we've often started out with the budgeting part. And then in that same package, we talked about expenditure and how you expenditure track, how you monitor, and then you report. And so those elements will definitely be very important. And as you say, sometimes this can be as simple as what a lot of banks are asking you to do now. When you make a purchase, you categorize that purchase, right? All this is saying is that before you do any spending and you do a budget, as most governments have to do, that you try to categorize those expenditures in budget lines. And so you know very clearly, well, what is my budget is going to agriculture, and is it agriculture or is it agriculture plus climate? You know, is it food security and nutritional security? And therefore, it also has a subsidiary tag, perhaps to health. Because part of what we're talking is not just the one tag, it's the fact that often when you do this tagging, there's a primary goal and there was subsidiary goals, because after all, it's one space, one ecosystem. And so what we're talking about is being able to do that tagging for those primary and subsidiary goals. And out of that, you should be able to then say, out of your overall budget, how much did I have climate change as a primary goal, and maybe how much did I have climate change as a secondary goal? How much did I have gender as a primary goal? How much did I have it as a secondary or tertiary goal? And if we're doing that tagging at the budget side, then when we do the implementation and we follow that, it should be a lot easier to then see where did our money go, who got it, and how it was spent. So I hope that's answered your question, because I'm firmly with you on the fact that expenditure tagging is key.
Yeah, I think your answer is great. I think those are great points. I would just say that in my experience, you can't always assume that just because you're doing budget tracking, it's being tracked on the expenditure side too, because that was one of the issues on our project, is that we were talking a lot about the budget stuff and just assuming that it meant that the expenditures would be tracked as well. And then it came up in one meeting and they were like, oh no, that's completely different. And we're like, all right, well, we should do that too. So I think it depends a little bit on how the finance system works, but it's something
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think this is definitely something that we've all realized, that when we start talking about budget tracking, we need to put in that expenditure piece, and we need to make sure the systems are there, and that whenever whoever is in the budget department or the finance department who's actually spending the money and reporting on the money is also following that tracking. Because again, one of the things that we want to do is not just look at the expenditure, but we also want to look at expenditure versus budget. If you look at the budget of the country, every single year when the country does the budget, it's supposed to report on what happened the previous year. And you know, how much of that budget was actually spent the way it was planned and how much was not before it goes into the new budget. And so the combination of those two processes is important for us to be able to do that kind of thing. But agree with you that yes, we shouldn't always assume, but part of, I think, the awareness building and the capacity building is to try to start making it, almost not automatic, but part and parcel of the same thing. Because sometimes what we've also found is that they're two different people. One person is dealing with the budget preparation, and one person is dealing with expenditure, and these two people don't talk until it comes to budget time. And then somebody says, oh yes, well now we need to look at how we spent our money and report on how we spent the money and what needs to be happened. And so I think we're trying to break some of those silos as well, in the way that government systems are set up, and the way that these things are kind of like separated out, in ways that sometimes actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And then it perhaps is not surprising that sometimes budgets run out because somebody's not tracking the expenditure, and they're not tracking the expenditure in terms of where it's supposed to go. And so money has been spent based on some mission and everything's being followed, but not on the extent of the budget, and not on the fact that there are other things that the budget was supposed to go to that are not getting the money. And so all of these are, of these are critical discussions that need to happen also around governance. But I think also it's about a fundamental rethink of our systems. And so these systems that we've also inherited, right, that we've never challenged or interrogated fully, and that perhaps are not a good match for the kind of integrated multidisciplinary approach that we need to take to our budget, I think is also part of a bigger question.
Yes, definitely. So thanks for that question, Kristen. I think that actually is a nice segue into what we were going to be talking about in the plenary group discussion, which is some of the challenges that we're having. So we're hearing that there's certainly some capacity, awareness, communication issues, governance issues that are part of the problem in terms of what we're seeing. But I just wanted to open up a discussion for others to maybe come in, and share any experiences they have, any questions they have around the open budgeting process, what challenges that they're seeing that really need to be overcome, or and what opportunities as well. So please feel free to jump in here, to put up your hand, to add stuff in the chat, if you want to share anything. And I don't know if anyone from the Jamaican crew that had worked on participatory budgeting for forest management wants to come in here and add anything as well, to the discussion.
Since you've called me out, Anka, this has been a really interesting discussion. So we had done that project with CANARI and JCDT, looking at participatory budgeting focused on forests. It was a new concept. What it allowed us to do was to have important conversations, if you will, with the entities. So we focused on national entities like the National Environment and Planning Agency, the Forestry Department. The biggest challenge we had was getting somebody from the Ministry of Finance to have a conversation with us. We had a meeting, we had an online session with the minister, and I was the person on board. It was a very, he listened, but he was not very open and responsive, let's put it that way. But one of the things I find is that we were learning in this year and a half of doing this project, or about a year and a half, and because it's project funding to do this, even though our capacity was built, we're still small in numbers and few. And even some of the CSOs that we had reached out to were not able to come on board because they just never had the capacity. So we formed this CSO Forest group with about 25 CSOs, but I would say maybe 10 really participated fully in the process. And so while we learned a lot, while we were able to see following through, I think is our biggest challenge because we're so small. So being able to have some funding, if you will, or a key person who has that, and as you say, you don't have to fully understand the budgeting process. You just need to say, listen, these are things that are important to us, and spread that out. But you also want to know, how is that included? When do you do it? I mean, we learned a whole long thing about how the budgeting process is, what happens when, blah, blah, blah. But, as I said, it was a good learning. But what we want now is that next phase to be able to actually follow through and make a difference. There was no climate responsive and gender responsive in what it is that we were looking at, although we were kind of using the climate because we're focused on forests. We're saying, well, why not talk about the climate advantages, if you will, if they included more funding for forests in the budget. And then we also reached out to local authorities. So at the parish, well, in Jamaica, we're talking parish council or municipal corporations. We reached out to ministers and then the agencies. I would say overall, we had some success, but not as good as it could have been if we had more time and additional funding. But definitely it opened us to that possibility. Now, I work mostly in the parish of Clarendon, and I was saying that Clarendon has a budgeting, so they take their budget around to the various town centers. And just last night, actually, they had a session, which I missed, and now they're doing it hybrid. So it can be online and in person. I think that's a good thing. Challenge I find is that you're getting the budget after it has been done.
Yeah,
so yes, you're able to discuss what they're going to do in expenditure and so on, but I'm not sure that we have a great influence. It's like, I think they think they are the budgeting people. This is their budget and their job is to, so they're ticking the box. They have come out and talked to us about it, but there is no real space, as I participate in them from time to time, for us to actually impact, make changes. Because they say, okay, this is the money that we have, these are our priorities. But I feel like they should come to us when they have a draft to say, these are their priorities. And, what are the other things? Or even before that to say, okay, what are your priorities? And then do the budget and then come back to us. That's not really how it's working. And I feel if we don't do that or have some people definitely getting into these processes, I don't think it's going to make a difference. I also feel sometimes these processes seem to be, it's almost as if it's presented over our heads, which makes it not so easy for us to participate. So we'll just kind of step back because honestly, you have so many other things thinking about if you're head of an NGO or if you're a lecturer or whatever it is that, if this is not what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So I find that we need to figure out a way to make the process easier for just about anybody who would want to and more inclusive. Because even sometimes when I go to some of the climate discussions in Jamaica, I feel like there's a list of persons and it's those persons who come all the time and they don't make arrangements to have the sessions hybrid or in a different path apart from Kingston or provide traveling or support for those other persons who might want to participate. So again, I feel that there is always that separation, that exclusion for anybody to participate. And, you try a few times and, let's go drink some rum around the corner. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, so thanks for sharing that experience, Ingrid. I think that's a very practical kind of real world experience of trying to engage with the budgeting process and help to make it more participatory and have some impact in the decisions that are being made. And I think you hit on a really important point or challenge, which I think Christina raised in the chat, talking about is one of the key challenges getting government stakeholders to buy in to the importance of mainstreaming gender, mainstreaming climate, doing all of this tagging, why put in all this extra work? And the fact that whether they even have the capacity, which I think you, Lisa, mentioned, and really understand how to do these things effectively to enable this process. So I think, that definitely has come out here. Lisa, I don't know if you want to jump in here. I think we are running out of time, so maybe only have like another minute or two. But if you just want to add anything or respond to anything in the chat, feel free.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, I think that the lack of understanding is key. And, I say cautiously that we don't have the capacity. The fact is that we do have capacities to do some of this stuff. It looks like extra work, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. And often what is being missed is that by doing this, you would actually have a better sense of where your real climate gaps are. And you would actually have a much more targeted and specific NDC and NAP. And you see where remember the table that Priya showed, where you had some of these gaps for countries, you would actually be able to fill some of these gaps. And so there are reasons for doing this, including your own promotion around your need for climate finance. Right now, a lot of our promotion and advocacy is very general, doesn't get into the specifics because we haven't done the analysis. But if we were tagging and tagging and monitoring these things, we would actually be able to say, look, Hurricane Beryl actually had this impact. We were able to, of our own money, we forked up X amount. And then we mobilized and we got some loans, but here's the actual gap that we have. And we still have this gap 3 or 4 or 5 years later, but often we're not able to say that because we're not doing the monitoring and we're not doing the tagging. And so I know it looks like extra work, but I think that the benefits outweigh the extra work in terms of the other questions it could help us to answer, and the way in which we could also just be managing our resources a little better. But definitely we need to do a lot more around gender and around climate and gender. There's been a lot of work done, and gender was very pivotal to that. But there's still also the fact that people are resistant, because people are resistant to the idea of gender being an issue in the region. And so we can't avoid that reality. People, I get all the time, but is this really relevant to us? This seems like an Africa or Asia issue. And then I say, and our population is made up of, and then silence. Because I'm like, well, yes, there are lots of things that were lost in the Middle Passage. Bad habits, unfortunately, were not. Hence gender-based violence. And then there are chuckles in the room. I say, but I'm saying this very seriously, because if you're saying to me that these are Africa and Asia issues, I think that it means we're missing something serious when we have on our paper every day in some countries some example of gender-based violence. When we have somebody talking about harassment, in the workplace, when we talk about people talking about unequal pay, you have issues even in Barbados right now talking about equity issues around, support and response from barrels. So I'm like, these are not Africa and Asia issues. They are our issues. They may be a little bit more nuanced, but they are our issues. And we need to start really paying attention to them, because I'm like, if you keep doing your census and you keep seeing the same groups falling behind, the same with the poverty survey, that tells us that these are real issues and we need to start tackling them.
Yeah. So I think that's a great way to wrap up maybe our conversation as we're out of time. I think we could have just continue talking about this for the whole day, but unfortunately we do have a time limit. So I'm going to say a big thank you to you for taking the time. I know you're in Colombia, so you're not even in the region. And so we really appreciated Saedi co-hosting this and being part of this presentation today for this session. Before I hand over to my colleague Neve to do the wrap up, I actually wanted to flag that Lisa, who's also part of our Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, and some of the work that we're doing. So I just wanted to note that the Alliance is actually planning to do some more focused, targeted advocacy beyond this webinar series on climate finance as a vehicle for climate justice. And so we're going to among a number of things, I think we also want to do a bit of a social media campaign over the next 4 weeks in the lead up to and during COP29 to try and really push some of these issues and make sure that it's front and center while these major negotiations are happening. So do let Neve and I know if you're interested in working with us. If you're not part of the Alliance, you can still say you're interested in helping us amplify these issues and get them out there. And so with that, I'll pass over to Neve.
Hi, thanks, Anka. Well, you kind of took my thunder there. I was going to share about our advocacy for our next steps. But yes, thank you, everybody. I'm going to drop our social media handles in the chat so that you can follow us and stay engaged there. We're hoping to kick off this climate finance advocacy by next week, and it will go through COP. So please stay engaged. And also I've just put in the chat how you can either reach out to me or learn more about becoming a Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance member. So yes, I'm going to drop those in right now. And yeah, just generally a big thank you for everybody who has come to any one of or all of the 4 webinars we've hosted so far. And yes, thank you all so very much. And thank you, Lisa, and well, no longer with us. Thank you, everybody.